What if everything we've been taught about death is wrong? What if death is not an end, but a beginning? Not a punishment, but a passage? Not darkness, but transformation? For thousands of years, ancient civilizations held a view of death so radically different from our own, it would seem almost alien today. While the modern world trembles at the thought of mortality, gripped by fear, denial, and the illusion of finality, the ancients saw death as something sacred. A doorway, a return. From the silent tombs of Egypt to the firelit rituals of the Vedic sages, from the dreamtime of Aboriginal shamans to the whispered teachings of the mystery schools, they all carried a secret about death that has been buried, not just by time, but by design. Forgotten by a world obsessed with permanence and lost in the noise of progress. But what if we could remember? What if we could peel back the veil and reclaim that lost knowing? In this journey, we'll explore how ancient cultures approached death, not with fear, but with reverence. We'll delve into their symbols, their myths, their metaphysics. We'll uncover the esoteric principles hidden in sacred texts, passed down by initiates who knew that death was not something to escape, but something to understand. This is an Abo-Imit religion. It's not about superstition. It's about decoding the wisdom embedded in ancient thought, wisdom that speaks of cycles, of consciousness beyond the body, of a soul that never truly dies. And as we walk this path together, you might begin to feel something stir within you, an ancient memory, long buried beneath the noise of modern life. So if you're ready to look death in the eye, not with dread, but with deep, sacred curiosity, then stay with me. Because what the ancients knew about death might just change the way you live. Long before the rise of organized religion or the mechanistic worldview of modern science, ancient civilizations looked upon death not as a tragedy, but as a natural transformation, one that followed the same rhythm as the sun setting into night, only to rise again. They saw in death a cosmic order, a return to the source, an unfolding of a greater mystery. The Egyptians, perhaps more than any other culture, mastered the art of dying. To them, the body was a vessel, sacred, yes, but temporary. The true essence of a person, the Ba and Ka, were aspects of the soul that would continue beyond the physical realm. The Book of the Dead was not a collection of funerary prayers, as often misunderstood, but a mystical guide for the soul's journey through the afterlife, a manual for consciousness navigating the unseen dimensions. In the Vedic traditions of India, death was never viewed as annihilation. Instead, it was samsara, the eternal wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. The soul, or Atman, was believed to be eternal, merely changing bodies like a person changes clothes. This wasn't seen as a romantic idea, but a practical truth, embedded in their daily rituals, mantras, and meditations. To die well was to live well, with clarity, detachment, and purpose. The Stoics of ancient Greece, too, taught that death should not be feared. Memento mori, they reminded themselves, remember that you must die, not as a morbid obsession, but as a philosophical liberation. By contemplating death, one becomes free from its grip. Marcus Aurelius wrote that death is simply a dissolution of the elements. Nothing more, nothing less. Meanwhile, indigenous cultures around the world, from the shamans of Siberia to the healers of the Andes, understood death through direct mystical experience. Through trance, vision quests, and sacred plant medicine, they pierced the veil and spoke of other worlds, realms of spirit, ancestors waiting beyond the threshold. For them, death was not just an idea, it was a place, a return to the great web of being. So how did we lose this wisdom? The fall began subtly. As empires expanded, new power structures formed. The mystery schools, once open to initiates willing to seek truth, were forced into secrecy. The rise of dogmatic religions turned death into a tool, something to be feared, something to be obeyed. Heaven and hell became moral prisons. The soul's journey became a reward or punishment, rather than an evolutionary process. And then came the age of materialism. With the Enlightenment came great advances in science, but also a rejection of the unseen. The soul was dismissed as superstition. Death became clinical, sterile, something to hide behind closed doors. What once was sacred became taboo. But remnants of the old knowledge remain, etched in stone, encoded in symbols, hidden in myth. And if we listen closely, if we learn to read between the lines, we can begin to recover what was lost. Because the ancients weren't naive. They weren't afraid. They saw death clearly, and in that clarity, they found liberation. To understand what the ancients knew about death, we must first shift how we define life. Modern thought sees life as the flicker of biology, cells dividing, hearts pumping, brains firing. When these stop, we say life ends. But ancient civilizations viewed life as a continuum, a pulse of consciousness moving through layers of form. Death, then, was not the opposite of life. It was the threshold between frequencies, a sacred crossing from density into subtlety. In the Hermetic teachings, those whispered through temples in ancient Kemet and echoed in Greco-Egyptian texts, there is a principle that speaks to this. As above, so below, as within, so without. It implies that what dies in the physical reflects a greater, unseen movement in the cosmos. Death is not chaos. It is symmetry, a release into the larger pattern. The initiate, trained in the mysteries, did not fear death because they had symbolically died many times before. Through rituals, inner alchemy, and ego death, they came to realize, I am not this body. I am not even this mind. They practiced letting go of their identity so completely that when the body eventually passed, their soul would not cling, but soar. Let's look at the mythology of Osiris, one of the oldest dying and rising gods. Osiris is killed, dismembered, and scattered, only to be reborn through the love and magic of Isis. But the story isn't just about resurrection. It's about the soul's disintegration and reintegration. Death is a breaking apart so that something higher can be reassembled. Every piece of you must be known. Every shadow, every fear, every forgotten self must be faced. That's the real work of dying. In Tibetan Buddhism, they speak of the bardo, the in-between realm, the liminal state after death where the consciousness is no longer tethered to form. In this space, one's inner reality becomes the outer reality. Thought becomes substance. Fear becomes form. Love becomes light. The untrained soul may panic, grasping at illusion. But the prepared soul recognizes the dream and moves through it. What's fascinating is how many ancient traditions taught preparation for death as a spiritual discipline. The Egyptians spent their lives preparing for it. The Stoics meditated on it. The shamans danced with it, and not because they were obsessed with death, but because they understood that to live deeply, one must die consciously. Even in ancient Mesoamerica, the Toltecs and Mayans had rituals and initiations where young men would symbolically die and be reborn. They entered caves, representing the womb of the earth, underwent fasting, silence, and dream work. When they emerged, they were no longer boys. They were knowers of death, and in knowing death, they became wise. But here is the deeper secret, and it is one modern society rarely dares to whisper. To fear death is to fear transformation, and transformation is the very essence of life. This is what we've forgotten. Death is not the enemy. It is the alchemist, the revealer, the liberator. It strips away the false, the rigid, the superficial, until all that remains is the eternal. The ancients didn't just know this intellectually. They lived it. They built pyramids aligned with stars, temples echoing celestial cycles, burial sites rich with symbols of rebirth. They knew that death wasn't something to be hidden. It was to be honored, faced, understood. And maybe that's why they lived with such clarity, such reverence. Not because they feared death, but because they respected it. They saw it not as a punishment, but as a passage. Not as an end, but as the next initiation. But how did this ancient intimacy with death vanish from our collective memory? The answer lies in the slow erosion of sacred knowledge, replaced over centuries by dogma, fear, and control. When empires rose, many sought not to understand the mysteries, but to own them. The spiritual became institutional. Mysticism became heresy. And death, once revered as a portal of divine transformation, was rebranded as a punishment, a final judgment to be dreaded, not embraced. Take the rise of centralized religion during the late Roman era. As Christianity grew into a state apparatus, many esoteric teachings were deliberately buried or reinterpreted. The concept of reincarnation, once discussed openly by early Christian sects like the Gnostics and the Essenes, was banned and deemed heretical. Why? Because reincarnation teaches that the soul is sovereign, that death is a doorway, not a verdict. Such ideas empower the individual rather than the institution. The Gnostic texts, hidden for centuries in caves near Nag Hammadi, spoke often of death, not as a punishment for sin, but as an opportunity to awaken. They believed that the material world was not inherently evil, but rather a veil to be pierced with gnosis, direct knowing. Death, then, was a shedding of illusion, a return to source. The mysteries of Eleusis, practiced in ancient Greece for nearly 2,000 years, revolved around the myth of Demeter and Persephone, life, death, and rebirth. Initiates were sworn to secrecy, but ancient authors whispered that those who underwent the rites no longer feared death. Why? Because they had seen something, experienced something, perhaps a vision of the soul's journey beyond the veil. Contrast that with modern culture, where death is sterilized, feared, and hidden behind hospital curtains and euphemisms. We no longer sit with our dead. We outsource grief. We forget the face of our ancestors. In ancient traditions, death was not the enemy of life, it was its mirror, a guide, a sacred partner. In Egypt, the Book of the Dead was not a book of doom, it was a book of light, a manual for navigating the afterlife, a compass for the soul. Even indigenous cultures, far removed from pyramids or scrolls, had deep understandings of death. In the Amazon, shamans speak of the second birth that comes after the last breath. Through plant medicine journeys, they simulate death, ego dissolution, detachment from the body, so they might learn to die before dying, and thus live without fear. And there's a striking thread that weaves through nearly every ancient tradition. Death is only frightening to the uninitiated. To the mystic, it is not a descent into nothingness, but a return to the one. But let's pause here, because this idea, though beautiful, raises a difficult truth. If we have lost the wisdom of death, what else have we lost? The fear of death doesn't just haunt us in hospitals or cemeteries. It infects how we live. It makes us cling to identity, possessions, status. We become afraid to change jobs, to end relationships, to let go of who we think we are. In this way, death phobia becomes life phobia. The ancients knew this. That's why death was not just a final event. It was a teacher, a daily practice. The Sufis say, die before you die. The Taoists see death as the great return, the dissolution into the Tao. The alchemists symbolize death with the black phase, Nigredo, the necessary breakdown before illumination. And here's the paradox that those ancient minds understood so well. To embrace death is to become immortal, not in the body but in essence, in awareness, in presence. When we stop resisting impermanence, when we no longer fear the falling of the leaves or the aging of the body, we enter the eternal now, the place where the soul resides, where death has no sting because we were never truly separate to begin with. And so, the ancients didn't fear death, not because they were naive or primitive, but because they had seen through it. They knew something we forgot. So what does all of this mean for us today in the modern world? How can we begin to reconnect with what the ancients knew about death, not just intellectually but experientially? The first step is to shift our relationship with death from one of denial to one of reverence. In ancient cultures, death was part of daily consciousness. It was not hidden or feared, but integrated into rituals, stories, and art. To bring this back into your life, start by making time to contemplate death, not morbidly but curiously. There's a powerful practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition called Maranasati, or death awareness meditation. Practitioners visualize their own death, not to generate fear, but to dissolve attachment. They imagine the body aging, dying, returning to the earth. And then they imagine what remains. Consciousness, presence, the observer. You can begin with just 5 minutes a day. Sit quietly, breathe, ask yourself, If I died today, what would remain unresolved in me? Don't answer with panic. Answer with presence. Feel the freedom that comes from realizing that most of what you worry about doesn't matter in the face of death. Another practice is ancestral connection. The ancients honored their dead not with grief alone, but with gratitude. They believed the wisdom of those who passed on could still guide the living. Try setting up a small space in your home with a candle, a photo, or a symbol of someone who's passed. Light a candle and speak to them. Ask for guidance. Listen. You might be surprised at what comes. If you feel drawn to more immersive experiences, consider symbolic death and rebirth journeys. These can be found in nature-based rituals, darkroom retreats, or breathwork sessions that simulate ego dissolution. These aren't for everyone, but for those who feel called, they can shatter illusions and open a new kind of vision. And then there is letting go. This is the real spiritual practice. Let go of identities that no longer serve you. Let go of the illusion of control. Let go of the need to know what comes next. The ancients taught that death is not just something that happens once, it is happening all the time. Every breath out is a little death. Every moment of surrender is a passage into something deeper. Modern society teaches us to fear endings, but the ancients invite us to trust them. So here's a simple but transformative exercise. Once a week, choose something to release. A belief, a fear, a habit, a possession. Bury it. Burn it. Offer it back to the earth. Not because it was wrong, but because your soul is growing beyond it. This too is dying before dying. And with each act of surrender, you'll notice something powerful. You become lighter, clearer, more alive. Because the secret is this: those who make peace with death are free to live without fear. They love more deeply, speak more honestly, and act with greater courage. Why? Because they are no longer trying to avoid the inevitable. They are dancing with it. That's the power of remembering what the ancients knew. Not just to demystify death, but to re-enchant life. Death, the great teacher, the final threshold, the one experience every living being must one day pass through, yet the one we've tried hardest to forget. But the ancients did not forget. They didn't run from it. They looked it in the eyes and found not a monster, but a mirror. They saw that within death lies the ultimate revelation, that we are not the body, not the name, not the story. We are the flame that flickers behind it all. Eternal, untouched, conscious. In Egypt, death was called the westing, the journey to the setting sun. Not an end, but a return. In the mystery schools of Greece, initiates who symbolically died before death were said to live twice, and fear nothing. And in the East, death was merely another breath in the lungs of the cosmos, an inhale into the unknown. We have lost this sacred knowledge, buried beneath concrete, dogma, and denial. But it still calls to us, quietly, in dreams, in synchronicities, in the hush of a loved one's passing. It whispers, remember, you are more than this. So, as you leave this video, I invite you not to forget, but to remember, to honor death not with fear, but with reverence. Let it be your reminder to live deeper, love louder, and wake up to the miracle of this moment. Because death is not the opposite of life, it is the keeper of its meaning. And in the end, the greatest secret the ancients knew is this: the more intimately you know death, the more fully you will come alive. If this resonated with you, take a moment to reflect, maybe even journal your thoughts. What did this awaken in you? And if you're ready to continue uncovering the forgotten wisdom of the ages, join us on this journey. Subscribe. Share this with a fellow seeker. Let's reawaken the ancient knowing together. The mystery is vast, but so is your spirit. Until next time, stay curious, stay awakened, and stay timeless.